The teacup sat on the counter. Steam curled from its rim, but no one had set out a chair. Mine was gone. The one by the east window. The one that caught morning sun and looked out at my lavender. Vanished. Quietly. Like it never mattered. I had only been away 2 nights. Just a routine check at the clinic. I came home with my sweater still smelling like hospital soap. And found my place erased. Melissa met me in the kitchen, her smile already rehearsed. "Welcome back, Mom. We've cleaned things up while you were resting. We moved your things into the back room. Sophie needed more space. Your old room is hers now." She spoke like it was kindness. Like she expected applause. Like moving me into a windowless box was a gift. I did not shout. I did not cry. I just walked down the hallway, past the photos they had replaced. Past the door that used to open with my hand. It was shut now from the inside. I heard cartoons. I heard Sophie's little voice. I heard the sound of someone else settling into the last corner of my life. The back room was cold. No windows. One flickering bulb. No socket near the bed. The floor still smelled of paint and forgotten boxes. They called it clean. They called it cozy. I called it exile. That night I opened my closet. The one they had not touched yet. And pulled out the brown envelope. Inside. The deed to this house. Signed in 1998. My name. And his. David's name wasn't there. Melissa's certainly wasn't wise. I sat on the edge of the narrow bed. No window. No light. But something stronger than sadness filled my chest. Resolve. I didn't want the room back. I wanted something bigger. I wanted to be remembered. As the woman who held the key. And this time I would not knock. If they take your chair, your light, your room, can you still reclaim your place in the house you built? The room that faced the roses. My husband built that window with his bare hands. It took him 3 weekends and a few too many cups of black coffee. But when it was done, the sun poured in like it knew where to land. That corner with the rocking chair, the bookshelf, the wool blanket was mine. Every morning, I sat there with chamomile and silence. And every evening he'd kiss my cheek as he passed by to the garden. He never liked fancy things. But he made sure my books had their own shelf. Sanded the edges smooth. Lined them with cedar oil to keep the moths away. That room, it wasn't just where I slept. It was where I stitched prayers into quilts. Where I learned to sleep on one side when his coughing got worse. Where I sat with my fingers still holding his hand the night before he passed. After the funeral, I didn't move anything. Not for months. His slippers stayed by the bed. His watch on the tray. The lavender bush outside bloomed too early that spring like it didn't know what it had lost. David offered to repaint it that summer. Said a fresh start might help. But I told him no. That room had its own language and I wasn't ready to forget how to speak it. When Melissa moved in, I made space. I cleared drawers. Labeled boxes. Even gave up the guest bath so she could have her lotions and candles. She liked things to smell like vanilla and eucalyptus. I never minded. I told myself, this is what mothers do. We give. We adjust. But some things are not meant to be redistributed. Like a rocking chair worn soft from 30 winters. Like a door that creaks the same way every time it closes. Like the sound of your name when it's still spoken with care. And now that room was full of toys and cartoon voices. My wool blanket folded at the edge of a stranger's bed. They called it growth. They called it practical. But I knew better. It was a quiet eviction. And I had just started remembering how to stay standing. I did not mind giving up space. Not at first. I had given up space all my life. In the closet when David needed a place for his little uniforms. In the kitchen when we turned my sewing table into a high chair nook. In my savings account when he needed help with the down payment on his first car. And when he got married, I told them both, this home is yours as long as you treat it like ours. They said thank you. They said I was generous. They said I made everything easier. I believed them. When they moved in after the baby, I cleared the guest room. Made sure there were nightlights and soft rugs. I even boxed up my quilting supplies and stored them in the attic. Melissa liked open space. She said clutter made her anxious. So I let go of corners. Let go of cupboards. Let go of routines. I started sleeping earlier. Eating in the sunroom instead of the kitchen. Stepping aside when they rushed in late from daycare or yoga or whatever modern thing filled their day. I was trying not to be in the way. Trying to be helpful. Trying not to take up more room than I was worth. Then one night, Melissa asked if I still needed the desk in my bedroom. Said they might use it for Sophie's coloring books. Said it would add flow. I said nothing. The desk was where I wrote letters to my sister before she passed. Where I had kept the recipe box from my mother with all her handwritten notes in fading blue ink. But I didn't say that. I just nodded and moved the box to my lap. They took the desk the next day. Wheeled it down the hallway like it belonged somewhere else now. David never looked back. Melissa said she'd give it a fresh coat of paint. The next week, they changed the curtains. Melissa said blackout shades were better for the baby's naps. The old ones, my lace panels, were stuffed into a trash bag with the words donate scribbled across. That was when I realized. They weren't rearranging the room, they were rewriting the story, one drawer at a time. One thread at a time. And I was letting them. The deed was still in the closet. Tucked behind my winter scarves in a manila envelope that smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. I had not looked at it in years. Not since my husband passed. Not since the lawyer slid it across the table and said, "It's all yours now, Mrs. Whitmore." Back then I nodded through the paperwork. Grief makes everything blur. I signed where I was told. Folded it away and forgot. Or maybe I tried to forget. Because remembering would have meant accepting that the house was truly mine and that I'd have to guard it alone. For years I let David take care of the taxes. Let Melissa call the plumber. Let them decorate the porch and change the locks and speak to the neighbors like they were the ones who belonged. I thought it was easier. I thought it was grace. But grace is not surrender. And silence does not mean consent. That morning, after the curtains were taken after the desk was painted over, I opened the envelope. The paper had yellowed slightly, but the ink was strong. My name Eleanor M. Whitmore. His name Samuel J. Whitmore. No David. No Melissa. No addendum. Just the two of us. The way it had started. The way it had been built. I traced the signatures with my thumb. Felt the weight of each letter. Remembered how we held hands in the lawyer's office, how Sam squeezed my fingers and whispered, "Now they can't take it from you even if I go first." And now, they were trying. Not with lawsuits or violence, but with smiles and baby blankets and slow steady erasure. They did not steal. They repurposed. They did not yell. They reorganized. And somehow that felt worse. Because I had welcomed it. Like a frog in warm water, never realizing when the heat had turned. But I wasn't boiled yet. Not all the way. That night, I slipped the deed into my purse. And I called June Garland. My husband's old friend. The one who filed the papers back in 1998. She picked up on the second ring. Said, "It's been a long time, Ellie. What do you need?" I took a breath. Help remembering what's mine. The first night in the back room I slept with socks on. The floor was colder than I remembered. And the mattress creaked like it didn't want me there. There was no window. No breeze. Just a lamp with a flickering bulb and a single outlet that sparked when I plugged in my heating pad. I unplugged it and wrapped my knees in a towel instead. In the dark I reached for the shelf above the bed. Only 2 books fit. The rest were in boxes now stacked in the garage next to old Christmas lights and a broken stroller. They called it reorganizing. They called it making room. But it felt like being shelved. The next morning I walked into the kitchen to make toast. Melissa was already there wiping the counters. She looked up startled. Oh, Mom, sorry. We had a bit of a mess with Sophie this morning. We were going to clean it up, I promise. She smiled that bright practiced smile. The kind you use with neighbors or mailmen. Not family. I nodded and poured myself tea. My favorite mug, the one with the blue forget-me-nots, was missing. Melissa offered me one with cartoon owls. Cute, right? She said. I found it at the thrift store. I said nothing. Just held the cup with both hands and waited for the kettle. David didn't look up from his phone. He was scrolling, chewing, nodding to something Melissa said about new furniture. We might need to rearrange the dining room, she told him. Maybe move that hutch out. It feels old. That hutch had been in the family since 1947. My mother's wedding china sat inside it for 50 years. The glass still bore a scratch from when David tripped into it at age 6. I had polished it every spring. Kept the key in a small dish by the window. Now it was clutter. Melissa turned to me. Would you be okay if we donated it? Of course, we'd keep anything important. Maybe store a few pieces in the attic. My mouth felt dry. I thought of the letter opener tucked in the top drawer. The one Sam brought back from Vermont. The one he used every Sunday to slice open the paper and hand me the comics. I didn't answer. Just finished my tea and left the room. They thought I was being passive. But I was just beginning to listen to the sound of my name fading from every corner of the house I built. Later that week, I went looking for my quilt. The one with the navy border and the faded yellow center. I had sewn it during Sam's last hospital stay. Each square stitched between shifts at the clinic and nights of quiet prayer. It used to sit at the foot of my bed. Heavy, warm, familiar. I opened the linen closet. Then the guest chest. Then the bins by the hallway. Gone. I found it 2 days later folded on the floor of Sophie's playroom beneath a pile of plastic blocks and a juice-stained blanket with cartoon animals. It was wrinkled. The stitches had pulled in one corner. A thread had snapped along the edge. I picked it up slowly, careful not to let my hands shake. Melissa walked in just then holding a bottle of milk. Oh, she said, surprised. I thought we could use it for story time. It looked soft. I looked at her. Really looked. She didn't see a problem. Not even a flicker of guilt. Just that same breezy calm. She likes snuggling on the floor, she added. It keeps her from fussing. I didn't answer. I folded the quilt in half. Then in quarters, ran my hand along the stitching. My initials were still there in one corner. EW. In blue thread stitched by candlelight. I took it back to my room. That night I wrapped it around my shoulders, sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the ceiling until dawn. No one asked where it went. No one noticed it missing. The next morning David was in the living room adjusting the thermostat. We're thinking of repainting, he said casually. Brighten up the place a bit. Maybe something modern. He didn't ask what I thought. Didn't ask if the walls, the very ones I had chosen with Sam in 1998, meant anything to me. I looked at the wall behind him. There used to be a painting there, a watercolor of the garden in spring done by Sam's hand. It was gone. Replaced with a black and white canvas that said "Live Simply" in bold, soulless letters. They called it style. I called it erasure. I turned back to my room. Closed the door. And opened the folder again. I had walked these floors for over 30 years. I knew where they creaked. Which step groaned near the pantry. Where the hallway caught the afternoon sun. But lately, the house no longer moved with me. It moved without me. They were planning a birthday party for Sophie. Melissa wanted to open up the layout. That meant pushing my rocker into the garage, moving the photo albums off the sideboard and clearing space for a rented balloon arch. She walked past me mid-sentence, holding a tape measure. Did not pause. Did not ask. This will be perfect, she said, gesturing to the dining room. If we move the hutch and the corner table, we can fit a dessert wall. That corner table, was where I had kept Sam's cufflinks, his watch, the thank you card from David's graduation. They were still in the drawer. But no one checked. Melissa turned to me and smiled. We'll keep it all safe, of course. I just need the space to flow. That word again. Flow. As if I were a rock in the stream, an old log in the way of something prettier. I nodded. Then walked to the garden. The lavender had started to bloom again. Late this year. Maybe it had waited for me. I sat on the bench under the plum tree, the one Sam built when David was 6. Carved into the side was a small heart and the letters EW plus SJ. I traced it with my thumb. Still there. Still ours. Inside the house I heard laughter. Music. Melissa's voice rising above the rest, explaining to the caterer how the space is shared but mostly ours now. I closed my eyes. Took a breath. They had taken the room. The desk. The curtains. The quilt. Even the name on the invitation said hosted by David and Melissa Whitmore. They were rewriting history. But I had the footnotes. And the title page. And the author's name. I stood up slowly. Walked inside. And made a list of everything they had moved without asking. By the time the list reached the second page, I stopped writing. It was time to stop recording. And start reclaiming. The noise started at 7. Drills. Footsteps. The sharp clatter of tools against tile. I came out of my room still in slippers. David stood by the entryway, phone to his ear, smiling. A man in overalls was removing baseboards with a crowbar. What's happening? I asked. David covered the receiver. Hey Mom. Nothing big. We're just opening up the back wall, adding sliding doors to the patio. It'll brighten everything up. You'll love it. I stared past him, watched dust floating in shafts of morning light. Watched another man roll up the rug, the one Sam and I had picked out in Charleston after our 25th anniversary. No one had told me. No one had asked. I walked into the kitchen, only to find the cabinets open, half empty. Melissa was rearranging the dishes. Just trying to make room for the new bar setup, she chirped. She gestured to where the old bookshelf used to be. That wall's coming down next week. We'll lose the pantry, but it's worth it for the flow. There it was again. That word. As if flow mattered more than foundation. More than memory. I opened the cabinet where I kept my tea. The tins were gone. Replaced by jars of powdered greens and oat milk. Melissa noticed. Oh, I moved your stuff to the top shelf in the laundry area. It's safer there. I said nothing. Walked slowly, my feet careful against the scattered sawdust. In the hallway, the framed photographs had been taken down. My wedding portrait. David's baptism. Even the drawing Sophie made last Christmas with all of us in front of the tree. Gone. The walls were bare. Painted over. Wiped clean. I stood still, hearing the rhythm of drills in the distance. Then I turned back into my room, my corner, my cold retreat. I pulled open the drawer of my nightstand, took out the folder again and called June. She answered on the third ring. They're renovating, I said softly. My signature's still valid, isn't it? There was a pause. Then her voice steady and warm. It's more than valid, Eleanor. It's the only one that matters. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. That afternoon I sat in the garden. Held the deed in my lap. Watched a patch of sunlight move across the grass. I did not cry. I did not rage. I simply made a plan. The next time they knocked, it was with a clipboard. A man in khakis and mirrored sunglasses stood at the door, clipboard in one hand, measuring tape in the other. Hi there, ma'am. We're here to assess the kitchen space. Heard y'all are thinking of knocking out the pantry wall. I stared at him for a long second. He shifted uncomfortably. I stepped aside without a word. Melissa came in a few minutes later, waving her phone. Sorry, Mom, I meant to tell you. We're getting an estimate for that open kitchen design I showed you. More counter space, better flow. David said it's fine. It's just a consultation. I nodded. That word again. Fine. They had started using it like permission. Fine meant already decided. Fine meant hush. That night I went to the garage. Not for old boxes. Not for memories. I went to see where they had stored the hutch. It was wrapped in plastic tilted against a stack of cardboard. A crack ran across one of the side panels. A single teacup sat inside tipped over. I reached in and straightened it. Then stood there for a while listening to the hum of the old fridge and the ticking of the water heater. This was where they put the past. Out of sight. Out of mind. Dust-covered. Disposable. I walked back in and found David at the kitchen island. Do you remember where we kept the Thanksgiving plates? I asked. He looked confused. The what? The china set. White with the gold rim. We used it every November. Oh. I think Melissa boxed that up. She said we don't really use it anymore. He went back to typing. I stood there. Not angry. Just. Still. Then I asked whose name is on the mortgage now. He blinked. I mean technically yours. But we've been covering the payments since Dad passed. You know that. I nodded. Do you still have the paperwork? He hesitated. I think it's in the desk drawer. Why? I smiled gently. No reason. Just wondering who still holds the keys. And I left the room before he could answer. 2 weeks later, the painting disappeared. The one Sam gave me for our 30th anniversary. Watercolor. Soft strokes of the lavender bush out back. He said it reminded him of how I moved when I hummed. I noticed its absence over breakfast. The nail still hung on the wall empty waiting. I asked Melissa if she'd seen it. Oh, she said, stirring her coffee. I took it down. We're going for a more minimal look in the hallway. I stored it safely, I promise. Stored. Like a winter coat. Like canned peaches. Like a woman who had outlived her usefulness. That afternoon, I opened the sideboard drawer, the one where I kept birthday cards, old keys, and the small wooden stamp set Sam used for holiday letters. Empty. Not misplaced. Removed. Melissa had done a full sweep of non-essentials. Her words. She called it decluttering. I called it something else. I called it deliberate. That evening after dinner, I found David in the backyard sipping a beer. I sat next to him. Watched the wind move through the tall grass. Do you remember when we planted the plum tree? I asked. He nodded. Yeah. I was 10? 8, I said quietly. You cried when Sam nicked his finger with the shovel. He laughed. Guess I was sensitive. I looked down at my hands. They were steadier than I expected. Do you remember who bought this land? I asked. He glanced sideways. Mom, what's this about? I'm just remembering, I said. I stood. Smoothed my sweater. And left him there. That night, I wrote a letter. To the county. Requesting a copy of the updated property record. Requesting clarification on active ownership and legal standing. I mailed it the next morning. At breakfast, I was quiet. Melissa didn't notice. She was talking about flooring options. David said nothing either. He had started watching me lately. Not with concern. With caution. As if he'd realized something in me had shifted. And he was right. They had taken the room. The desk. The quilt. The painting. But the foundation, that was still mine. And I was finally ready to remind them who laid it. It started with a drawing. Crayons on construction paper. Sophie had brought it home from preschool beaming. Look, Grandma, she said. That's our house. She pointed to a little square with a triangle roof. Stick figures smiled out front: David, Melissa, Sophie, and even their dog. But not me. No silver hair. No cane. No figure at all. I forced a smile. "It's lovely, sweetheart." She hugged my knees and ran off, leaving the picture in my lap like a mirror. I sat there for a long time, tracing each figure, each line, each absence. Later that day, I pinned it to the fridge. Let it stay there for a week. No one noticed. Not Melissa, who passed it a dozen times. Not David, who reached for milk just inches away. It was like the picture had told them something they already believed. That I didn't live here. Not really. Not anymore. That night, I walked the hallway barefoot. Past the pantry with no food I recognized. Past the shelves where family albums once stood. The lights were all off. But I knew the way. I reached the door to my old room, now Sophie's. I didn't open it. Just stood there. Listened to the quiet hum of her nightlight. Imagined the quilt still on her bed. Imagined Melissa's scent in the closet, vanilla, and ambition. I remembered what Sam once said on a rainy night when David was small. "A house doesn't stay yours unless you protect it." Back then, I thought he meant from thieves. Now I knew better. The real theft happens in soft tones and shared smiles. In phrases like, "We just thought it made sense," and "It's still your home too." But the truth was louder in silence. Like the empty space at the dinner table when they forgot to set a fourth plate. Like the unopened mail addressed to resident. Like the sound of my footsteps echoing through a hallway that no longer remembered me. I went back to my room, pulled out the file again, and looked at the papers one more time. My name was still there. Bold. Clear. Undeniable. That was the moment I stopped hoping. Stopped waiting. Stopped imagining they would change. They would not return the room. Or the painting. Or the name. But I still had the deed. And I still had time. The following Sunday, they hosted a brunch. Melissa's friends came. David grilled sausages. Someone brought almond cake in a box that looked expensive. I stayed mostly in my room. It was easier that way. Less noise. Less pretending. Near noon, I heard a knock. Grandma Sophie called. "Come sit with us." I opened the door. She was holding a paper crown made from construction paper and tape. "It's for you," she said. "You can be the garden queen." I smiled and bent down. Let her place it gently on my head. It tilted to one side. Held by hope. She led me outside. A long folding table stretched across the patio. White cloth. Glass pitchers of lemonade. Everyone was seated except me. Melissa looked up. "Oh. We weren't sure if you'd join. There's a seat. Back near the fence." She pointed to a folding chair set apart from the main table, next to a stack of gardening tools and a wilting potted fern. I stood for a moment. Crown still on my head. Lips still holding a half smile. Sophie looked up at me. "Is that okay, Grandma?" I nodded. Because what else could I do? Say no and make her cry, say yes and betray myself. I sat. The chair wobbled slightly. The sun hit my shoulders too directly. No one asked if I wanted a plate. No one passed the butter. I folded my hands. Looked out toward the plum tree. And remembered the last time Sam trimmed it. He had balanced on an old stool and grinned down at me. "Still your castle," he had said, snipping a low branch. "Still your throne." Now I was seated near the compost bin. The music played softly. People laughed. Melissa took a group photo with her friends. David leaned in holding Sophie. They did not turn to include me. I adjusted the paper crown. It slid forward. I let it fall. Picked it up. Set it on the garden bench beside me. And stood. Quietly. I went back inside. Closed my door. locked it. Then I reached for the phone. Found June's number. Left a message. "Hi, it's Eleanor. I'm ready to move forward with the paperwork. Let's make it official." I hung up, turned the lock again, and breathed. Not heavy, not angry, just clear. The kind of clear that comes after fog finally lifts. The kind that says they may hold the chairs and the camera, but I still hold the deed. The paperwork came in a plain envelope. No bold stamps. No urgency printed on the front. Just my name in steady type and a return address that made my chest feel steadier too. Inside the deed, a notarized letter from June and a short note in her handwriting. "Everything checks out. You're still the sole legal owner. Let me know how you'd like to proceed." I sat at the table with the envelope in my lap. The same table where I used to slice peaches, sew buttons, and help David with math homework. Now it was bare. Melissa had streamlined the decor. Only a bowl of white stones remained. No fruit. No fabric. No memory. I ran my fingers along the edge of the envelope. Thick. Sturdy. More solid than I had felt in weeks. I didn't act right away. Not out of fear, out of precision. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't even punishment. It was reminder. Correction. The gentle kind. The kind written in ink and witnessed by law. The next morning I folded the documents neatly. Placed them in my purse. Carried them to the garden bench. Carol, my neighbor, saw me from across the hedge. "Ellie," she called, wiping her hands on a towel. I waved. She came closer, leaning over the fence. "You okay, sweetheart?" I nodded. Then, paused. "Do you remember when Sam and I bought this place?" Her eyes softened. "Of course I do. You had that green truck with the crooked bumper. Sam built the fence by hand." We both smiled. "Would you be willing," I asked slowly, "to sign a statement? Just to confirm what you remember about us owning the house, how long we've lived here?" Her smile didn't change. She just nodded. "Of course. You want me to come by now?" I nodded. She stepped inside and returned a few minutes later with a pen and a pot of rosemary. "Something to keep by your window," she said. "For grounding." We filled out the witness form together. Her handwriting curved slightly like mine used to. She signed. Pressed the pen into my hand. "You're not doing this to push them out," she said gently. "You're doing it to pull yourself back in." I looked up. Eyes stung, but nothing fell. She was right. I wasn't reclaiming the house. I was reclaiming my place inside it. I did not rush. Each day I made small movements. Measured. Deliberate. Like someone resetting a room, one object at a time. I began with the hutch. One afternoon while they were out, I went to the garage, pulled back the plastic wrap, and ran my hands along the wood. The crack was still there. But so was the shine beneath the dust. I wiped it down. Steady strokes. Soft cloth. Like polishing an old memory until it breathed again. Then I called a man Sam used to know, a local carpenter who once repaired our porch swing. He came 2 days later, nodded at the hutch, and said, "Still solid." He took it to his workshop for refinishing. Melissa never noticed it was gone. David didn't ask. They were too busy picking backsplash tiles. Next I visited the county clerk's office. Not the online form. In person. Blouse pressed. Hair pinned back. I asked for a certified copy of the deed and filed a notice of intent to revise residential status. The woman behind the desk read my name. Then looked up slowly. "You're the owner?" she asked. I smiled. "Since 1998. She nodded. Stamped the form. That sound, the firm clap of official ink meeting paper, echoed louder than any apology I would ever get. Back at home, I opened my bottom drawer. Pulled out the spare key Sam had hidden in a velvet pouch. Still there. Cool to the touch. Heavy with memory. That night I brewed tea. Chamomile with a slice of dried apple. I sat by the garden door, steam rising through the quiet. The walls no longer felt like strangers. I placed the key on the table beside me. Let it rest. Let it remind me. I still belonged here. Not just in name, but in presence. This wasn't about forcing anyone out. It was about making space for myself again in plain sight. On the deed. And in the daily rhythm of a house that still knew my step. Melissa found me there the next morning. She paused in the kitchen doorway, saw the key, the papers, the calm in my hands. She opened her mouth, but said nothing. Just turned and left the room. That silence. It was the first honest moment between us in months. The hutch came back on a Thursday. Polished. Repaired. The crack sealed with care, but not hidden. The man placed it gently in the dining room, right where it had always stood before it was sent away, like an old woman with too many stories. I filled it slowly. The wedding china. The recipe box. Sam's cufflinks in their velvet pouch. A folded quilt square. A pressed leaf from the first fall in this house. Melissa walked in as I was adjusting the last teacup. She froze in the doorway. You brought it back. I nodded. She stepped forward, brows pinched. We just talked about making more space. This is space, I said softly. For what came before you. She looked at me. Really looked. Like she didn't recognize the woman standing there. Like I had become something new overnight. But I hadn't. I had just returned. David came home that evening. Saw the hutch. Looked at Melissa. Then looked at me. I said nothing. Just handed him a folder. Inside the certified deed, the updated residency notice, Carol's witness statement, and June's cover letter. He read in silence. His lips parted, then closed again. When he finished, he held the folder loosely, like it might break if he gripped it too tight. I didn't know you were doing all this. You didn't ask, I said. He nodded once. The air in the room felt dense but not angry. Just full of things unsaid. Melissa was quiet. She stared out the window. Arms crossed. Jaw set. David spoke again. What are you going to do? I looked down at my hands. Still. Open. I'm going to stay, I said. In my home. In my name. In the place where I buried lavender roots with your father. No one replied. But nothing was thrown away that night. The next morning, Melissa passed me in the hall. No smile. No words. But the old painting, Sam's watercolor of the garden, was back on the wall. Crooked. A little too high. But there. I adjusted it gently. Stepped back. And breathed. They had not apologized. They might never. But something had shifted. Not loudly. Not fully. Just enough. Enough to mark the return of a woman who never truly left. June met me at her office on a Tuesday morning. The air smelled like old paper and peppermint tea. Her desk was still cluttered just like it had been in 1998. Pens in a chipped mug. A faded photo of her cat, and a small plaque that read, "Quiet doesn't mean weak." She looked up as I entered. Well, she said, ready to move from memory to motion. I nodded. Saturday down. Unfolded the envelope in my purse. I want it in writing, I told her. That this house, every room, every corner, is legally mine to control. Not to punish. But to protect. June gave a slow smile. About time. We went over every page. Clause by clause. Reaffirming rights, updating status, setting boundaries that could not be rearranged with a smile. She explained the process for re-establishing primary authority over residency decisions. Told me it would take 2 signatures and a notary. told me the law was already on my side, we were just turning up the volume. Before I left, she touched my hand. You're not doing this out of spite, Eleanor. You're doing this out of memory. And memory matters. I walked home slowly, the papers tucked against my ribs like armor. When I stepped inside, the house felt different. Not lighter. Not warmer. Just real. Melissa was rearranging throw pillows. She looked up as I passed, then looked away. David was in the garage. I heard the shuffle of boxes, the hum of a man avoiding his own discomfort. I placed the folder on the kitchen counter. Visible. Intentional. Later that evening, I made dinner. Chicken stew. The way Sam liked it, simple with thyme and a splash of lemon. I set 4 plates, including one for myself, at the main table. Melissa blinked when she saw it. Said nothing. Saturday down. Sophie climbed onto her booster seat. David muttered a soft thanks, Mom. We ate. No music. No small talk. Just spoons tapping, bowls, steam rising, and a quiet that didn't feel empty for once. After dinner, I picked up the plates, tucked the folder under my arm, and turned to them both. I'll be sending formal notice next week. It won't change the day-to-day unless you make it so. David looked at Melissa. She crossed her arms, but said nothing. I'm not asking for a room, I added. I'm reminding you whose name is on the lock. I left them there, together but suddenly separate. Back in my room, I placed the folder in the drawer beneath my quilt. It rested easily, and so did I. The letter arrived on Friday. Thick envelope. Official seal. Delivered by hand. Melissa was in the kitchen when the doorbell rang. She opened it, signed without looking, and set the envelope on the counter like it was junk mail. I waited. Gave her time. Let silence stretch between the walls like sunlight in winter. Later that afternoon, I saw her open it. Her face did not change, but her hands stiffened. She read the letter. Twice. Then again. David came in from the garage. She passed it to him wordlessly. He read it standing. His shoulders rose, then dropped. No one said anything. Not for a full minute. Then I spoke, calm, steady. It's not an eviction. You'll stay as long as you need. But the terms are now mine to decide. David opened his mouth, then closed it. Melissa stepped forward. So you just... What? Serve us papers and call it justice. I shook my head. I serve clarity. Because too many things went blurry in this house. Including me. She scoffed. Turned to David. I told you this would happen. I told you if we let her take over. You didn't let me do anything, I interrupted. I simply remembered who I am. And acted accordingly. David looked tired. Older than his years. The kind of tired that came from decades of stepping around truth. He didn't defend me. Not out loud. But he didn't tear up the letter either. That night, they didn't speak to me. The lights in their bedroom stayed on late. I heard murmurs low and sharp. Then quiet. In the morning, David sat at the table with coffee. I poured mine beside him. We didn't look at each other right away. Then he said, I didn't know it meant that much to you. I stirred my tea. Let the spoon click gently against porcelain. It didn't. Until I realized I'd been erased. He looked down. Tapped the rim of his mug. Then nodded. Sophie ran into the room. Jumped into his lap. She waved to me, grinning wide. Grandma, guess what? I drew you a picture. You're in the middle this time. I smiled. Sometimes, healing begins where the page gets redrawn. The picture was taped to the fridge. Crayons on yellow paper. A house with 4 windows. 2 big trees. And me right at the center, hair in loops, a purple dress, and a smile that stretched the whole line of the page. Melissa hadn't commented on it. but she hadn't removed it either. That in itself felt like a shift. I kept to my rhythm. Poured tea in the morning, fed the birds, watered the lavender, restored the shape of my life slowly like coaxing a garden back after a long drought. One afternoon, I opened the closet in the hallway, the one where they had stuffed my photo albums into boxes marked, "Donate." I lifted each box one by one until I found the right one. Inside our wedding album, David's baby shoes letters from Sam tied in faded green ribbon. I carried them to the living room, laid them out on the coffee table. Not for a display, not for a fight, just to exist again. When David passed through, he paused. "Is that from the lake trip?" he asked, pointing to a photo. I nodded. "You caught a fish the size of your arm. You cried when we made you let it go." He chuckled. Then sat. Picked up the album. Melissa passed us 15 minutes later. Her footsteps slowed, then faded into the next room. She didn't sit. But she didn't stop it either. Progress in inches. That evening, I drafted a new letter. A soft one. I laid out clear terms, shared residency, defined spaces, the understanding that all major decisions must now pass through me. It wasn't about power. It was about presence. I printed it, signed it, slipped it under their bedroom door. No legal language. No seal. Just handwriting and a note at the bottom. I am still here. That night, I slept better than I had in months. No voices behind doors. No locked drawers. No erasures. Just the house breathing again. Not perfectly, but openly. And I knew whatever came next, I was back inside the story. The silence didn't last. 2 mornings after the note, Melissa cornered me in the hallway. She stood with her arms folded, eyes, sharp, voice low. "So this is how it's going to be now. You make rules, we just live under them." I met Herr Hase. Steady. Not unkind. "I didn't make new rules," I said. "I just reminded you of the ones that were always there." She scoffed. "You act like we took something from you. But you gave it. You said this house was our home too." "I said it was yours to share," I replied. "Not to claim." She shook her head, stepped back. "You're turning everything upside down, Eleanor." David's stressed. Sophie's confused. "We're doing our best." I could have snapped. I could have listed every time they forgot I existed. Every chair moved. Every memory boxed. But instead I just said, "I know you're doing your best. But so am I. And I won't apologize for finally showing up in my own house." She stared at me. Like she didn't know who I was anymore. Maybe she didn't. Maybe I had hidden too well for too long. Later that afternoon, a letter arrived. Not from Melissa. From the HOA. Apparently, there had been a complaint about unauthorized occupancy restructuring. Someone had flagged a permit concern. Someone had whispered into the system. David handed me the envelope, without a word. I read it slowly. Set it on the counter. Then turned to him. "Did you file this?" His jaw tightened. "Number." I believed him. But I also saw the hesitation, the space where courage used to be. "I'll handle it," I said. He didn't stop me. I called June. Explained the situation. She told me exactly what to say, what to print, what to show. The next day, I walked into the HOA office. Alone. I laid down the deed, the witness statement, the photographs, the certified records. When I finished, the woman behind the desk looked up slowly. "I don't think we need anything else, Mrs. Whitmore. Thank you for clarifying." I nodded. Outside the sky was soft gray. Threatening rain. But I felt clear. Like the air had shifted. Back home, the house was quiet. Sophie was napping. David was in the garage. Melissa sat at the kitchen island flipping through a magazine. She didn't look up. But she didn't move away either. I poured tea. Chamomile. Let the warmth sit in my hands. And for the first time in a long time, no one asked me to move. The following week, I received a letter from the county clerk. A quiet envelope, but inside confirmation. My updated residency rights had been officially recorded. My authority as sole homeowner was reinstated without challenge. No one else had filed anything. No one contested. It was over. Legally, at least. I sat at the dining table with the letter in my lap. Sam's name was still on the original deed beside mine. His signature a little faded now, but still there. I traced it with my finger. Felt steadier. I took a deep breath. Not of victory. Of arrival. That evening I made roast chicken. The old way. Paprika and lemon and a sprig of rosemary tucked beneath the skin. I set 3 plates. Melissa didn't come down. David sat across from me. He didn't say much. Just passed the salt and helped Sophie cut her carrots. Halfway through the meal, she looked at me and asked Grandma, "Are you going to stay here forever?" I paused. Smiled. Maybe not forever. But long enough. She nodded as if that made sense. Then went back to her mashed potatoes. Later that night David found me folding laundry in the living room. He stood there for a moment, hands in his pockets. "I'm sorry," he said. "For not standing up, for forgetting what this place means to you." I kept folding. "You didn't forget," I said softly. "You just stopped remembering out loud." He nodded. Then added, "I'll talk to Melissa." I didn't respond. That was his to carry. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. Saturday in the rocker by the window now returned to its old spot. The garden outside was misted but still visible. Lavender swayed lightly, and one bird landed on the fence, tilting its head toward me like it knew. I rocked gently. Listened to the floor creak beneath me. That sound so familiar, so ignored, felt like a heartbeat. The house was breathing again. With me. Not around me. And I thought Sam would have liked this. Not the fight. But the stillness that came after. Where truth could settle like dust returning to old wood. The garden was blooming again. I noticed it the next afternoon when I stepped outside to hang laundry on the old line. The plum tree had budded early. A stubborn, quiet act of timing. Sophie followed me out with her sketch pad. She liked to draw near the bench. She called it Grandma's thinking spot. She didn't know that it used to be where Sam read the paper or where David once scraped his knee climbing too high. She only knew it as mine. I watched her sketch for a while. She had given the tree a face. A smile. Roots that looked like arms reaching out to hold the earth. Then she asked, "Are you mad at Mommy?" The question landed softly, but firmly. I bent down beside her. "No," I said. "I think Mommy and I just forgot how to listen to each other." She nodded. "I forget to listen too. Especially when I'm hungry." I smiled. "Me too." That night Melissa knocked on my door. She didn't come in. Just stood in the hallway. Barefoot. Holding a folded blanket. "I washed this," she said. Held it out. My quilt. The one she'd once used for Sophie's playroom. Now freshly cleaned, the stitches still holding. "I didn't mean to take so much space," she said quietly. "I just didn't know how to share it." I took the quilt. "I think now you do." She nodded. Her eyes were tired, but softer. We didn't hug. Didn't cry. Just paused long enough for something unspoken to settle between us. Not forgiveness, but mutual gravity. Later that evening David helped me bring the hutch back into its original place. We adjusted it an inch to the left where it had always fit best. Then we shared a cup of tea, not over conversation, but over presence. And I knew. This wasn't a return to how things were. It was the quiet start of how things could be. A home not defended, but recentered. A legacy not shouted, but steady beneath every floorboard. They had taken the room. But I took back the frame. And inside it I was whole again. Spring arrived with more color than I expected. The roses outside my window, the ones I thought had withered, came back in full bloom. Soft pinks, open and unapologetic. Like they had waited for me to notice them again. I had started moving slower in the mornings, but not from pain. From choice. From intention. I made tea in the blue forget-me-not cup. Set the table with one napkin. Opened the curtains wide. And sat. Not in the corner. Not in the shadows. In the middle of the light. Some days Sophie joined me. She brought crayons and cereal and asked questions with no easy answers. Did Grandpa ever sit here too? Were you ever scared in the dark? Is this house older than dinosaurs? I told her yes. To all of it in some way. We read picture books. We folded napkins into birds. We talked about names, how they stay or slip depending on who remembers them. She started calling it Grandma's kitchen again. No one corrected her. David began spending more time near the garden. He cleared the weeds. Mended the gate. Hung up the wind chimes Sam had once made from spoons and string. Melissa didn't say much. But she left my bookshelf untouched. Even added a new book to it one afternoon. A memoir about quiet women who refused to disappear. She didn't hand it to me. Just placed it on the shelf. That was enough. In the evenings, I sometimes stood in the hallway. Looked at the family photos we'd slowly brought back. Not all of them. Not perfectly placed. But they were there. One of Sam and me in front of the old truck. One of baby David in his knitted hat. One of Sophie with chocolate on her chin. I had started writing again. Not a book. Just letters. To Sam. To my sister. To myself 10 years ago. I kept them in a wooden box by the bed. Not hidden. But not offered either. Some things are just for keeping. And every now and then I ran my hand along the frame of the door. The one they had once closed on me. Now it stayed open. Not because they left it that way. Because I did. And that made all the difference. The house makes different sounds now. Not quieter, just clearer. The floor still creaks by the pantry. The faucet still hums when you turn it too far left. But every sound feels like mine again. Mine to live in. Mine to leave behind. Some evenings I sit on the front steps with a shawl around my shoulders. Sophie comes out with a book. She reads aloud, stumbling over big words, but never skipping my name when she sees it in old stories. She always finds my name. Last week, she asked what a legacy was. I didn't have a simple answer. So I showed her. We opened the photo album. The one with brittle pages and corners held together by time. She pointed to a picture of Sam holding baby David. Is that you taking the photo? She asked. I smiled. It was. She leaned her head on my arm. And whispered. Then you're in it too. Later, after she went to bed, I set a pie on the counter. Apple just like Sam used to make. I left a slice for David. He ate it without a word but placed his hand on mine when he finished. That said enough. This home has seen so many versions of me. Wife. Mother. Shadow. Now something quieter. But no less present. I do not need their permission to matter. I never did. And one day, long after I'm gone, maybe they will look at the quilt or smell the lavender, or find my letters in a drawer they almost overlooked. And they'll remember. Not just that I lived here. But that I stood. That I stayed. That I reclaimed the center without raising my voice. And that is the story I will leave. Not in bold ink. But in the grain of the wood, the bend of a rocking chair, the echo of a woman who knew. You don't need to shout to be written into the walls. What quiet legacy do you hope to leave behind? We'd love to read your story in the comments below. You are not alone. Your journey matters. Subscribe to Grandma Radio, where every story is a second chance.